and she and the other cruisers were firing on the Johnston all this time using dye shells of various colours, mustard, purple, yellow, by which the observers could track their aim. The results of the torpedo attack were not observed visually. However, it can be positively stated that 2 and possibly 3 underwater explosions were heard by 2 officers and many enlisted men in the repair parties at the time our torpedoes were scheduled to hit. Upon emerging a minute later from the smoke screen, the leading enemy cruiser was observed to be burning furiously aft. Then the Johnston began to catch it, partly because her angle of attack was such that all the Japanese cruisers within range could fire on her, and they did. At 7:30 a.m., this ship was hit for the first time. It is believed we were hit by 3 14-inch projectiles. Those were battleship shells, followed 30 seconds later by 3 6-inch projectiles from the cruisers. These hits knocked out the after-fire room and engine room, all power to the steering engine, all power to the after 3 5-inch guns, and rendered the gyro compass useless. The ship was slowed to 7 knots, about half its regular top speed, and steering had to be done manually. The radar went out for 5 minutes, and the radar antenna was snapped off by a shell, but the fire direction radar was still operable. The guns had to be controlled either manually or partially, instead of automatically by computer. Luckily, after taking this pounding, the Johnston managed to find a rain squall and hid in it for 10 minutes while the officers assessed the damage and began controlling it. Then the Johnston went back into the fight, first taking on a Japanese destroyer and then bulldogging after the cruisers again. All this was done in the storm by radar, and 100 rounds were fired. At 7:50 a.m., Johnston's time was still not that of the others. Orders were received by talk between ships for small buoys, destroyers, to make a torpedo attack. Here is the talk between ships' report of what happened in the next few minutes. 7:45 a.m. Order came from the flagship. Small buoys form up for second attack. Over. 7:50 a.m. This is Taffy 3. All Great Danes stand by to open. This is Georgia. Overture from Wilco. Out. Taffy 3, are your torpedoes ready? Over. Affirmative. This is Dreadnought. This is Taffy 3. All small buoys go out and launch torpedo attack. This is Overture. Wilco. Taffy 3. All carriers make smoke. Over. Torpedoes are heading toward Carrier Group Mercury 3 from execute upon receipt signal. Turn Taffy 3. Shackle George X-ray. Unshackle foe. From Are you hit? Over. Taffy 3. This is foe. Negative. Taffy 3 from Fish headed for Great Dans. Out. Juggernaut. 8:02 a.m. Mercury 3 from Taffy 3. Fatima 4. This is Fatima 4:14 a.m. Mercury 3 from Taffy 3. 8:20 a.m. Taffy 3 from Catnip. Foe from Taffy 3. This is foe. 8:21 a.m. Taffy 3 from Catnip. 8:24 a.m. This is Taffy 3. Small buoys from Taffy 3. 8:26 a.m. Taffy 3 from Mongrel. From Taffy 3. This is Fig Leaf. This is Taffy 3. Small buoys from Taffy 3. This is Mongrel. This is Overture. This is Fig Leaf. Signal execute upon receipt. Turns Hackle, Nanking, Unshackle, out. These were manoeuvring instructions to the fleet from Admiral Ziggy Sprague. Do you have planes coming in on 290? Negative, but they show light. Signal execute. Shackle George King, Roger, unshackle, out. The forward engine room is flooded. Say again, have you been hit? Negative. Good go. I have been hit hard. I have lost one engine. Over. Roger. Out. Small buoys on my starboard quarter intercept enemy cruiser coming on my port quarter. Intercept enemy heavy cruiser coming in on Bendix's port quarter. I have him closing in now. We have no fish left. Stay on station and continue smoking. We have no fish left. Roger. Out. When the order came for small buoys to make a torpedo attack, the destroyers formed a formation with the Johnston, which had already fired, furnishing fire support for the whole Heeman and Roberts, which were going in as we turned to retire. After the other destroyers had fired their torpedoes, range closed to 6,000 yards on the leading Japanese cruiser, and many hits were obtained on it. At this time, retirement was commenced with the aid of a heavy smoke screen. At approximately 8:10 a.m., the Johnston emerged from a heavy smoke screen only to find the USS Herman on our starboard bow on a collision course with us at a distance of about 200 yards. The captain backed full on the one remaining engine, and the Herman was observed to back on all engines. A collision was thus avoided by the narrowest possible margin. At about 8:20 a.m., a battleship of the Congo class suddenly appeared out of the smoke, 7,000 yards distant on our port beam. By this time, the captain had given the order not to fire on any target unless we could see it, the reason being that enemy and friendly ships were now in the melee. Approximately 40 rounds were fired at the Japanese battleship at our necessarily reduced rate of fire before retiring behind our own smoke screen and before being taken under fire by this battleship. Several hits were observed on the Pagoda superstructure, and a carrier, the Gambia Bay, was hit. This ship attempted to draw fire away from the Gambia Bay by taking the cruiser under fire. At this time, the range was closed to 6,000 yards, and maximum fire was brought to bear on this heavy cruiser. This attempt, as was to be expected, was unsuccessful despite numerous hits. At about 8:40 a.m., fire was checked when it became obvious that the Japanese destroyers on our port hand were closing rapidly on the carriers. Upon receiving this information from combat, the captain directed our course toward the enemy destroyers, who were deployed in a column with the apparent leader in the van, followed by 2 divisions consisting of 3 destroyers apiece. The Japanese destroyers were sighted at a range of about 10,000 yards, and fire was immediately opened on the destroyer leader. Our fire appeared to be extremely effective, and the range continued to close to about 7,000 yards. This ship was hit several times during this one encounter by 5-inch shells. Approximately 12 hits were obtained on the leading Japanese destroyer before a most amazing thing happened. The destroyer leader proceeded to turn 90 degrees to the right and break off the action. Fire was immediately shifted to the second destroyer, and hits were observed at the initial range of around 8,000 yards. During firing on this second destroyer, the captain, what a dynamo he was, attempted to cross the T on the Japanese column. However, before this was accomplished, amazingly enough, all remaining 6 Japanese destroyers turned 90 degrees to the right, and the range began to open rapidly. The talk between ships transmission, as noted earlier in the talk between ships report, had been received just prior to our opening fire on these Japanese destroyers, directing the small boys to interpose between the carriers and Japanese cruiser on their port quarter. We checked fire as the Japanese destroyers retired, turned to the left, and proceeded to close the range on the Japanese cruisers. For the next half hour, this ship proceeded to engage first the cruisers on our port hand and then the destroyers on our starboard hand, alternating between the 2 groups in a somewhat desperate attempt to keep them all from closing the carrier formation. The ship was getting hit with disconcerting frequency during this period. The Johnston could very well have retired at any time after the initial torpedo attack, in which one of her engines was shot out, and she was so sorely injured. But Captain Evans chose to fight, and thus must be credited very heavily with the salvation of the American escort carriers that day. He fought for 2 hours, and during this rather hectic time reported Lieutenant Robert C. Hagan, who was to be the senior officer surviving the battle. We were engaging many ships at only medium ranges. There were several occasions where the ship still could have crept away and escaped further damage, which she was continuing to receive. At this time we had taken 12 to 14 hits. We had 2 guns that were fully in operation, 2 others that could have fired only manually. Our maximum speed was still 15 knots, and killed and wounded littered our decks. Despite all this, it is interesting to note that the captain still refused to leave the area and fought the Japanese force continually, turning them back until the ship was finally snowed under with an avalanche of shells. The captain had been injured very early in the game when the radar was snapped off. 3 officers were killed on the bridge, and all Captain Evans's clothes above the waist were blown off. Lieutenant Hagan reported he was injured rather severely at 7:30 a.m., 2.5 hours before we abandoned ship, to the extent of a couple of fingers blown off, an unknown number of shrapnel holes in his back, and superficial wounds about his face and neck, all of which were drawing considerable blood. Despite these injuries, the captain fought that ship as no other man has ever fought a ship. The shells that came hurtling in knocked out the Johnston's remaining engine room and fire room. The director and plot lost power, all communications failed, and all the 5 guns failed except for number 4, where the crew continued to fire manually until the end. It was about 9:45 a.m. when the captain gave the order to abandon ship, an order every man had been expecting at almost any time. 10 minutes later, the survivors were off the ship, and she rolled over and sank. 15 minutes after that, just to make sure, a Japanese destroyer closed to within 1,000 yards and fired at point-blank range even as she went down. Then came an ordeal that no one aboard the Johnston had really expected. The survivors stayed in the water for many hours. No one knows how many survivors there were in the beginning. The captain was alive when they went into the water, and so was the executive officer. Also in the water were perhaps 200 other officers and enlisted men, in various conditions from badly wounded to totally unhurt. They had 3 life rafts and 2 floater nets to keep them alive, and they thought it would be a matter of a couple of hours if they could only stay afloat. The sharks came, attracted by the blood. They took some men and spat out one particularly sour old salt who would carry the marks of the shark's teeth with him. Within 2 hours, the men's hopes were raised by the appearance of several PBYs, which zoomed and apparently went on to report their presence in the water to friendly forces. But no one came. The hours went by, and still no one came. Men died, and no one came. Men slipped off the ropes from exhaustion, and no one came. The captain disappeared, and no one came. It was cold and lonely in the sea, even if the weather was hot and humid. The planes did not come back, and they did not bring life rafts or survival gear or anything. The heroes of the Johnston were left alone to face the rigours of the cruel sea. Believe it or not, 2 days and 2 nights went by before anyone thought to save the men of the Johnston. During that period, at least 45 officers and men, including the gallant captain, succumbed to wounds or died of exposure or shark bites. "One more day," said Lieutenant Hogan, "and no one would have survived." But after 50 hours, help finally came, and 141 officers and men were saved. Part of the reason for the abandonment of the men of the Johnston was the thorough confusion into which Admiral Sprague's escort carrier force was thrown by the Japanese attack. There were plenty of other casualties. The next ship to get it from the Japanese was the destroyer Hoel, a part of the same screening force. The Hoel was the lead ship, with Commander W.D. Thomas aboard as the man in charge of the screen. Her captain was Commander Leon S. Kintberger. Like the rest of the task group, the men of the Hoel were shocked when the word came that the Japanese were firing on an American plane. How a large Japanese task force like this could sneak up on our escort carriers is something that I will never be able to understand, said Lieutenant Morris F. Green of the Hoel. Here is the story of her attack and adventure as told by Lieutenant Green. We decided to fire a half salvo at the leading battleship and save the other half for the leading cruiser, because it was definite that we would have to turn at least 2 columns of ships in order to be of any assistance in screening the escort carriers. All the Japanese turned and fled. There is no explanation why. They could have wiped out every ship in our formation. At 7:25 a.m., we received the first hit on the bridge, which destroyed all of our voice radio communications and also the remote radar plan position indicator on the bridge. This shell also killed several personnel, including the helmsman and captain. Less than 5 minutes later, we received a hit on the main battery director, putting it out of action and also killing our anti-aircraft officer, making it necessary for the anti-aircraft guns to go into local control. We had an officer at each 40 mm mount, but there was nothing within range of the 40 mm to fire at. The ship launched its torpedoes. The first torpedoes had been aimed at the battleship Congo, and she avoided them. The second torpedoes were aimed at the Haguro, leading the cruiser column of the Japanese. The Hoel was being hit. Her port engine was knocked out, and her rudder jammed, causing her to head directly for a Japanese battleship. Hardly a healthy maneuver. Her afterguns would not fire. She kept getting hit. It was 7:35 a.m. when that second group of torpedoes was fired under extremely difficult circumstances, and they were on one engine and hand steering from aft. The torpedo officer, Lieutenant Glenn W. Coleman, was on number 2 torpedo mount and had no communication with the others. He rushed down to the mount from the bridge in 30 seconds after communication failed and discovered the situation. The hits were coming fast. His chief torpedo man had been killed. 5 forward torpedoes had been fired, so he went to the aftermount and found it had been trained out according to instructions he had given earlier, and he had a setup on the leading cruiser, Haguro, 5,000 yards at an angle of 50 degrees. He fired 5 torpedoes. They ran hot, straight, and true, and large columns of water arose at the side of the Haguro at the time that the torpedoes should have hit. The Japanese, however, claimed the Haguro was not torpedoed, and there again the discrepancies of battle stories came through the confusion. With our 10 fish fired, we decided it was time to get the hell out of there, said Lieutenant Green. It was nearly impossible. They were now boxed in by Japanese ships, and it was estimated that in all some 302 3-gun salvos were fired at the Hoel. They tried to go southwest, chasing salvos on the theory they might thus escape the next one. This proved impossible because we were boxed in on all sides by enemy capital ships. We fishtailed and chased salvos and made all possible speed on one engine, which enabled us to continue to remain afloat. The Japanese battleships were 8,000 yards on the port beam. We had heavy cruisers 7,000 yards on the starboard quarter, and we had only 2 guns left to fire. They were forward, which made it difficult to continue firing while attempting a retirement. These 2 forward guns must have expended 250 or 300 rounds. At 8:30 a.m., we lost power on the starboard engine due to several more hits in engineering spaces and throughout the hull. These hits must have been armor-piercing ammunition because very few of them detonated. Some of them, which I believe to have been 16-inch shells, came through one side of the ship and went out the other side without detonating. The smaller shells, the 5-inch shells or smaller, which appeared to be anti-personnel shells, did detonate, and they are the ones that caused us to have such heavy casualties. When our power was lost in the starboard engine, leaving us with no engine power at all of our engine spaces were flooding and our number 1 magazine was on fire. 5 minutes later, word was passed to prepare to abandon ship. All this time we were losing way, practically dead in the water. At 8:40 a.m., with the ship dead in the water and a 20 degrees list, word was passed to abandon ship. Then they had to send back forward for the gun crews of the 2 5-inch guns who kept on firing, until the list was so bad it was obvious she was settling by the stern. The enemy continued to fire on the Hoel until 8:50 a.m. Some of these shells did drop short. Those that hit killed many men attempting to abandon ship. Those that fell short killed men in the water. At 8:55 a.m., the ship rolled over on her port side and sank stern first. I was about 50 yards away from the fantail at this time, and I was alone in the water, but did manage to swim to a life raft. Later, we joined the captain and the Commodore, Commander Thomas, who was pretty badly hurt, and we managed to tie 3 life rafts together. Now came a repetition of what happened to the Johnston. The task group simply abandoned the men of the Hoel. We spent 48 hours in the water with no visible attempt being made to find us, which we questioned later and found that no attempt had been made. No planes were sent out, no destroyers were sent out. When we were picked up by a landing craft infantry, a very small one, number 341, 48 hours later, we found that they had been sent to the wrong location to pick us up. Somebody certainly fouled up here because we had been operating in the same water every day in the summer. So they waited. There were no underwater explosions, luckily, and all they worried about were sharks and rescue. 2 men managed to float to Samar Island and were picked up by guerrillas after 4 days in the water. Only 19 were formally listed as dead at the end of the battle, but 252 were listed as missing or dead, and only 82 came home. And there were 2 other casualties in the screening group. One was the Heermann, and she went into battle gladly under her captain, Commander Amos T. Hathaway. "Buck," he said to Lieutenant Robert F. Noom, his officer of the deck and navigator. "What we need is a bugler to sound the charge." The Heermann followed the Hoel in on the torpedo attack without certain results, but the results to the Heermann were not long in coming. Said Commander Hathaway, "After we fired our last 3 torpedoes at the enemy battleship, I went inside the pilot house, called the Admiral on the talk between ships, and told him my exercise was completed. I don't know quite why I used those words, and I remember having an idea in my head that the Japanese might be listening in on the circuit, and I didn't want them to know that I didn't have any more torpedoes. I don't believe the Admiral understood me either, as a little while later they asked me if I had any torpedoes left. While Hathaway was inside making this report, his crew said they saw one of the Heermann's torpedoes hit the enemy battleship in an aftergun turret. It was marked by a huge geyser of water. The depth setting on the torpedo had been only 6 feet, which was much too shallow for battleship torpedoing, but they had identified the battleship very late. Captain Hathaway decided to get out of the area and closed on a destroyer, which he thought was the Hoel. It turned out to be the Johnston. He went with her for a bit and then left because the Johnston was obviously unable to keep up speed. She was mortally injured. Her radar was hanging down on her yard arm, and she sent the mournful message, "Only 1 engine, no radar and no gyros." That was only part of what was wrong, of course. The Heermann was trying to make 35 knots to get out of the area, and suddenly out of the gloom the Fanshawe Bay appeared, one of the escort carriers, and it was only by backing suddenly that Hathaway managed to avoid a collision. He had no sooner avoided this ship than the Johnston came at him. This time it was too close for comfort. We missed the Johnston by a mere matter of about 3 inches. People could have touched as our bows missed each other. Everyone thought we would hit. They passed safely as men on both ships cheered in relief. The Japanese were firing on the escort carriers, and as the Heermann came rushing back from her attack, she neared the Gambier Bay, one of the escorts under fire, and the Japanese cruiser which was shooting took the destroyer under fire for a time. The Heermann started shooting back. It was 8:41 a.m. when we started firing at the Tone-class cruiser. There were 3 other heavy vessels, identified as heavy cruisers, astern of her and 2 other vessels, possibly destroyers. I zigzagged and chased splashes for about 20 minutes. 4 minutes after the action began, the Heermann took her first punishment, a shell on the bridge, which killed 3 men and wounded the steersman mortally. It also brought a touch of tragic irony. On the day before, the Heermann had picked an aviator named Lieutenant Darren out of the water, and Hathaway said he never saw a man more grateful for rescue. This morning, Lieutenant Darren came up on the bridge and asked to help in the fight. The captain told him to go help the gunnery officer on the director in spotting planes that might come in on them, and off went the pilot. But after a while, when there were no Japanese planes, he went back to the bridge to find the captain. Just then, another assignment came in, and a shell killed the lieutenant who had gotten his second lease on life the day before. The captain would probably have been killed by that shell too, but a few moments before it hit, he had decided the bridge was a bad place for fighting the ship. The shell's splashes of straddle shots were sending water so high that he had difficulty seeing, so he had climbed up to the fire control structure and thus saved his life. When the steersman was killed, Chief Quartermaster John P. Milley was thrown to the deck too. He got up on his knees, reached over the wounded steersman, and took the wheel, carrying out an unexecuted order from the captain with the coolness of a man on an exercise. The talker repeated the order with the same coolness, just to be sure Milley had it. When the voice tube was damaged by shrapnel, the talker moved closer to the captain so he could hear. Quartermaster Second Class Jack Woolworth, another survivor on the bridge, had been badly wounded in the buttocks, but he never whimpered and took over the jobs of the engine order telegraph man and the bridge radioman after they were killed. The battle seemed almost unreal, as it apparently did to everyone. We were under fire from 4 enemy ships at this time. I realized it was 4 ships by the fact that there were several colors of splashes, red, yellow, green, and no color splashes around us. It looked like a rainbow. There was more red than anything else. In fact, it looked kind of rosy looking through it, although I guess it was probably rosier for the Japanese than it was for us at this particular moment. They hit us with one 8-inch hit in the uptakes, one down on the keel, one about the waterline forward of gun mount number 1, and one hit our sound dome. Then the Heermann was hit by a salvo, which caused considerable damage. The damage control parties got busy. At 9:05 a.m., I turned the Heermann and started across the rear of the carrier formation to lay another smoke screen. We couldn't see any targets within our gun range at the time, and it looked to me as if the screen was getting a little thin back there, so I decided to lay another. At about 9:07 a.m., a Maya-class cruiser closed on us from astern. We squared off with her and started to shoot it out. She engaged us for 3 minutes, then retired and opened the range further than we could shoot. One of the interesting facts about the action that day was that when the Japanese came swooping down on this little force of destroyers, it was all that stood between the slow, lumbering escort carriers and total destruction. The fierceness with which the Americans fought translated itself into a misrepresentation on the part of the Japanese. The escort force was made up of destroyers and destroyer escorts, but because the destroyers did not fear to engage 6- and 8-inch cruisers in gun battles, the Japanese got the mistaken impression that they were engaging cruisers and destroyers, making them that much more cautious about coming up and polishing off the fleet, as they certainly could have done. At 9:10 a.m. we quit, said Commodore Hathaway. We finished laying the smoke screen across the rear of the carriers. A very few minutes later, Admiral Sprague told the small boy on the starboard quarter to go out to the port quarter and get there as fast as they could. I had seen that both the hull and the Johnston were damaged, and realized that the Heermann, even though she was damaged, was probably the most effective destroyer left. I started to try to get out there. Being flooded forward, it was very difficult for us to make much speed. We were asking the engine room for full power, and they were giving it to us, but with all the flooded condition by the bow, we were actually making only about 25 knots. I believe we were down so far that our anchors were ploughing a furrow through the water, even though it was a particularly calm day. By 9:30 a.m., the Admiral had ordered Formation 5 Roger, our normal cruising formation, and I realized that the enemy must have retired. How fiercely the Americans fought, and under what conditions, destroyers and escorts and airplanes against a 22-ship enemy fleet, including the biggest battleship in the world, is well illustrated by the behavior of the little destroyer escorts. These ships had not been nearly so heavily used in the Pacific as in the Atlantic, but their purpose in both oceans was the same: to work against submarines and to serve as rescue ships for downed aviators. They were much smaller than destroyers, and their major weapons were torpedoes, but they had been so slightly used as attack ships that the group of destroyer escorts in the area this day were totally untrained in attack tactics. Thus, when the pros of the destroyer force, the Johnston, Heermann and Hull, went in to attack the Japanese, one of the Little Wolves, destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, tagged along behind. Her captain, Lieutenant R.W. Copeland, United States Naval Reserve, went in, even though the regular Navy officers of the destroyers had more or less indicated that he ought to go off and play by himself where he would not get hurt. Here is the story of the Samuel B. Roberts. When Copeland asked if he might come along, the screen commander in Hull gave him a quick no, but told the destroyer escort to form up for an attack of their own. Apparently, none of the other destroyer escorts heard the order. After waiting about 5 minutes for some indication that other destroyer escorts were forming for an attack and finding none, the commanding officer, finding his ship in an advantageous position from which to make a torpedo attack, called upon Combat Information Center for a torpedo attack course, and followed in about 3,000 yards astern of Hull and Johnston. One might suspect that the skipper of the Samuel B. Roberts waited just long enough so that he would not be accused of getting in the way before he made his own charge on the Japanese fleet. The Samuel B. Roberts snuck up on the enemy through smoke made by the bigger destroyers ahead of her, and she was not seen. She did not fire her 5-inch gun forward, although the captain itched to do so. The Roberts was able to approach to 4,000 yards without being detected, which meant she and the Japanese cruiser column were coming at each other at a speed of nearly 50 knots. Now the Roberts began to take hits as they moved in close. The speed of the torpedoes should have been changed to compensate, but while pairing the retiring Johnston, the Roberts caught a stray shell aimed at the larger ship, which hit the radio antenna and knocked it down. The antenna fell on the torpedo tubes and dislodged the speed-setting wrench, so they had to go with what they had at intermediate speed. They fired, and flame, smoke, and a column of water were observed near the waterline below the secondary control of the Ioba-class heavy cruiser leading this column. At 8:05 a.m., the little destroyer escort began firing on a Tone-class cruiser, starting at 10,000 yards and working down to 5,300 yards. Just to be sure she was close enough, she fishtailed, sped, slowed, turned, and tried to stay out of the way of the Japanese fire, and she fought with unbelievable vigour. What confusion existed among these little ships fighting for the lives of their big sisters. Here is an indication from the Roberts action report. At about 8:40 a.m., the Roberts got clear of a near collision between the Johnston and the Heermann. All ships were laying smoke and firing at Japanese targets. She changed course to the left to interpose between Japanese cruisers and our carriers, as directed about 5 minutes previously by Task Unit Commander. By 8:51 a.m., she received her first hit, a salvo that put a hole below the waterline in No. 1 lower handling room and ruptured the main steam line in No. 1 fire room, putting No. 1 fire room out of commission and reducing maximum available speed to 17 knots. As the range closed to 4,000 yards at about 9 a.m., hits were coming in rapid succession. No. 1 engine room was hit and knocked out, and a heavy shell, either 8 or 14-inch, hit the superstructure deckhouse aft and exploded, completely obliterating the after-twin 40mm mount and after-40mm Mark 51 director. No further trace of the mount, gun shield, or director was ever seen. At about 9 a.m., a tremendous explosion took place, believed to be hits from 2 or 3 14-inch high-capacity shells, which tore a hole some 30 to 40 feet long and about 7 to 10 feet high in the port side at the waterline. This salvo wiped out No. 2 engine room, ruptured the after fuel tanks, and started fires on the fantail. All power was lost at this time, and the ship aft of the stack was left an inert mass of battered metal. The ship was now incapable of motion and without offensive or defensive measure left to her. After all, power, air, and communications had been lost, and before the word to abandon ship was passed, the crew of No. 2 gun, who as a crew distinguished themselves throughout the entire action, loaded, rammed, and fired 6 charges entirely by hand, and with the certain knowledge of the hazards involved due to the failure of the gas ejection system, caused by the air supply having entirely been lost. While attempting to get off the 7th charge in this manner, there was an internal explosion in the gun, killing all but 3 members of the gun crew, 2 of whom subsequently died on rafts. No underwater explosions were noted, as the ship was abandoned at about 9:10 a.m., and those left, nearly half the crew, moved off the ship, first placing the wounded on rafts. The Samuel B. Roberts listed, lay over on her beam ends, then gave a twist and sank by the stern. With the men in the water, it was the same story as for the others. After retiring, 3 of the Japanese ships, a Katori-class light cruiser and 2 Asashio-class destroyers, passed close aboard survivors of this vessel, who were in the water clinging to nets and rafts, and took motion pictures but did not fire on any of the survivors in the water. Then they waited. The men were in the water for 50 hours. They were in 2 major groups, 1 raft and 1 floater net, and a group of 2 rafts and a floater net, but some were adrift, hanging onto 5-inch powder cans or shoring or staging. Sadly, those men were not rescued. During the afternoon of the action, we were sighted by friendly aircraft, one of which buzzed us from low altitude to let us know we had been sighted. We were amazed and our morale reduced by seeing no activity indicating a search for us on the following day, and men died who need not have died until the searchers came for them. Other destroyer escorts fared better. They were the Dennis, the John C. Butler, and the Raymond. The Raymond took on an enemy cruiser that was moving in on the formation. Between 7:35 a.m. and 7:40 a.m., a torpedo wake was observed approaching and passed the ship 20 yards to port. Then, at 7:43 a.m., Admiral Sprague ordered the escorts to attack with torpedoes, and the Raymond headed toward the enemy. The Japanese, meanwhile, were launching a torpedo attack of their own against the escort carriers using 8 or 9 destroyers. The Raymond fired her torpedoes, 3 of them, at 7:56 a.m. from 10,000 yards. Some men thought they hit the cruiser they were aiming at. Possibly it was the same cruiser that the Samuel B. Roberts fired at. Then she turned and returned to the formation without being hurt, while the Roberts was taking the punishment. At 8:28 a.m., the Raymond was ordered off to port to intercept the Japanese cruisers that were moving in. She started shooting and was straddled once but not hit. Meanwhile, she expended 414 rounds of 5-inch ammunition herself in firing at the enemy. No wonder the Japanese thought they were fighting cruisers and destroyers. The Dennis went after a cruiser too, and fired her full salvo of 3 torpedoes at once. She began firing and hit a Japanese cruiser with her 5-inch gun. Then, at about 8:45, she was closed by 8 Japanese destroyers and began taking hits. One hit on the port side, 3 feet above the first platform deck, went out the starboard side, 3 feet above the waterline. A man in a repair unit was killed. Shell fragments damaged the hull, and another hit on the 40 mm after director killed 2 men. And other hits came near the No. 1 gun. There was some flooding, and the men threw overboard in weighted sacks some registered publications just in case. Then came SPR's order to resume formation, and suddenly no one knew quite how. The Japanese were gone. 6 men were killed or died of their wounds and were later buried at sea. The John C. Butler story was much the same, except that she did not manage to get into position to fire her torpedoes. One of the cruisers took after her with salvos, 4 of which landed close aboard, but that 5th one never came, luckily. She was soon dispatched to make smoke to protect the escort carriers. Again she got off free, the luckiest of the bunch of wolves and little wolves, as they were so rightly called in this particular battle. If the battle occurred off Samar and not actually in the San Bernardino Strait, still at the end of it was one phase that stuck in the memory of all concerned. It concerned the strait through which the Japanese had debouched to make their surprise attack upon the Americans. The Japanese were deliberate rather than aggressive in this action, and made very little effort to close the range, except in certain cases. They stood off and continued to fire with 8-inch guns and 6-inch guns for about 2.5 hours. The object of this shell fire was only incidentally the destroyers and the escorts, although they were worrying the Japanese fleet like the wolves and little wolves they claimed to be. What the Japanese wanted to knock out were the 6 escort carriers of Taffy 3 they had swooped down on so suddenly. Admiral Ziggy Sprague was truly Bega, and his ships were much slower than the fast-fighting ships of the enemy. He was being attacked on the 2 flanks by a column of destroyers and a column of cruisers, and coming up behind, capable of blowing him out of the water easily, were the battleships. He could not head into Leyte Gulf and hide. He could not overrun Taffy 2, Admiral Stump's command, and bring destruction to him. He had to zig and zag and hope for help. Sending the destroyers out to fight a holding action, he turned east. Then the cruisers came up on the left, and he turned southwest again. The destroyers threatened with a fruitless torpedo attack, and he zigged again. The Japanese cruisers were close enough so that the 5-inch guns of the escort carriers were firing on them. That was what they had: 5-inch guns, 1 each of those, the ability to make smoke to conceal themselves and their airplanes, if they could get clear enough to move into the wind to launch and recover. Otherwise, launch and recovery was very dangerous. The Kinin Bay was the first escort carrier to get into trouble. The formation was roughly 2 lines of 3 ships each, with the centre ship in the forward line slightly ahead and the centre ship in the second line slightly behind the others. The Kinin Bay was in the centre position in that second line, and was thus the last ship of the formation. She had been having trouble that morning. At 4:15 a.m., long before anyone suspected the coming of the Japanese through San Bernardino Strait, she had trouble with her port engine, and emergency repairs were made so she could keep up and launch her aircraft when the time came. Actually, she had no responsibility that morning, and no planes were launched at dawn. But not for long. Her action report gives a feeling for the urgency of the manner in which the Japanese presence was discovered that morning. A plane on anti-submarine marine patrol from USS Keenan Bay reported to the officer in tactical command a task force composed of 4 enemy battleships, 6 cruisers, and numerous destroyers bearing 270 degrees at a distance of 20 miles from this formation. At 6:54 a.m., the pilot of the plane definitely identified the task force. This information was conveyed to the ship over the Interfighter Director Net 37.6 MHz. Immediately after this report, excited Japanese voices were heard over the Interfighter Director Net. A frequency test was made, and it was found that the Japanese were directly on 37.6 MCS. On orders from the officer in tactical command, General Quarters was sounded at 6:58 a.m., and speed increased to flank. Scheduled or not, the morning launching began on the Keenan Bay. All available planes were made ready, and the pilots were instructed to attack the Japanese, and then shuttle to Tacloban airstrip, which, although an army installation, could be presumed to be friendly. As it turned out, it was not very friendly. The army was awaiting the coming of army planes, not navy planes, and it took 30 men some time to recognize the emergency aboard the ships for what it was. But that is not properly a part of the story of the fleet. By 7:25 a.m., while shells from the Japanese cruisers were falling all around the carrier, she had launched what she had to launch. The force included 3 TBMs loaded with 500-pound bombs, 1 each, 8 5-inch rockets each, 6 TBMs loaded with 10 100-pound bombs each, 8 5-inch rockets each, a TBM loaded only with ammunition, and 10 FM-2S fighters with ammunition. There were also 2 TBMs on the hangar deck that were temporarily out of commission. These were loaded with torpedoes in anticipation of repair. Finally, later on, 3 more fighters were launched. By this time, the crew of the Keenan Bay was talking ruefully of their ship as Tail End Charlie, and betting that they were taking more fire than anybody else in the formation, an honor they would gladly have given up to anyone in sight. The escort carriers ran, making smoke and firing, and the Japanese cruisers chased at a very leisurely pace. The Keenan Bay took her first hit at 7:50 a.m. and took 14 more shells before the Japanese broke off the action. All the shells were 8-inch shells from cruisers. Here is the damage they did. Shell #1 entered the port side about 2 feet above the deck in the Boston stores and went out directly opposite 1 foot lower without exploding. This meant the shell was armor-piercing. This was a very definite Japanese error in shooting at the unarmored escort carriers, for high-explosive shells would have wreaked havoc. Shell #2 and #3 entered the port side almost together at the platform deck and caused flooding to a depth of 5 feet. Shell #4 hit the carpenter shop 6 feet above the hangar deck, passed the elevator pit, and went out the starboard side without exploding. Shell #5, a near miss, maybe from a battleship. Shell #6 entered an officer's stateroom, passed through a store, and exploded in the port aviation lubrication oil tank. This did real damage, flooding the forward engine room temporarily. Shell #7 came in across the port, hit in the aviation armory, went through a bulkhead into the ship's armory, down through the platform deck and the machine shop before exploding. The machine shop was a mess. All motors were flooded and doused with oil, and the compartment was flooded to a depth of 10 feet before it was pumped out and controlled. The shell started a fire in the aviation armory and the upper part of the machine shop, a fire that lasted for 2 hours and was put out 3 times before it subsided. Shell #8 exploded under the counter of the fantail and did serious structural damage to the ship, smashing part of the sprinkling system. Shell #9 exploded 5 yards off the fantail, and the nose smashed through the mess attendant compartment, severing cables too. Shell #10 went through the flight deck and then broke up, sending dangerous splinters through one officer's room and out the starboard side, rupturing the forward vertical bar chain of the elevator. Shell #11 came through the flight deck, wrecking the I-beams that supported the elevator, exploded and wrecked the forward elevator platform control box, and twisted the platform. Radio Room 2 was smashed partially, and the radar control room 2 and 1 fragment hit an acetylene bottle near the carpenter shop, starting an intense fire in the hangar deck. Another fragment ruptured fire lines and flooded the deck. Shell #12 came through the flight deck too, damaging the radar equipment greatly and starting a serious fire. Shell #13 passed through the forward starboard tack just outboard of the catwalk. Shell #14 came through the flight deck, raised a riot in the flight crew lockers amidships, and tore holes in the crew's bunk room bulkheads. Another fragment damaged 4 I-beams in the flight deck. Shell #15. The last went through the flight deck, tore a hole in the stack starboard, and went out through the starboard side, wrecking 3 I-beams in the flight deck. Surprisingly, perhaps because so much of the fire was armour-piercing, all day the ship suffered only 5 men killed and 55 wounded. Meanwhile, she was giving back a good account of herself with the 5-inch gun. Here are the Kinnin Bay's claims for the day. When the enemy cruisers closed the range to 18,000 yards at about 8 a.m., the 5-inch 38 caliber gun of this ship was ordered to open fire. The cruisers closed to 17,300 yards. Fire was continued, and at about 8:25, at a range of approximately 16,000 yards, a direct hit was scored on the No. 2 turret of the Nachi-class heavy cruiser by this vessel. The 5-inch gun commenced rapid fire after observing this hit, and another hit was made on the same cruiser just below the previous one. After the first hit, the No. 2 turret was observed to be slowly enveloping in flames, and the second hit caused a quiet burst of flames which completely obscured the turret. The cruiser then turned hard to port and withdrew from the formation temporarily. It was a tough, frightening fight, and from the carrier point of view it is not better described than as seen from the decks of old tail-end Charlie. At about 8:30 a.m., 5 destroyers were sighted on the starboard quarterhead on view, approaching in column formation. Their identity was not known, and at first they were thought to be friendly units coming to assist. It was not until they opened fire on our formation from a range of approximately 14,500 yards that they were known to be hostile. At this time, the heavy cruisers attacking from the port quarter were obscured by the smoke screen laid down by friendly escorts. The men of the Kinnin Bay kept on firing at the Japanese, but shifted to the destroyers. On came those destroyers, closing in until they reached a point 10,500 yards away. Then they were recognizable with high bows, 2 gun mounts forward, and heavy tripod masts. The Japanese destroyer salvos came close, many passed overhead, but they were not shooting like the cruisers. The smoke faded, and the cruisers started shooting too, which made it futile to try to take evasive action by zigzagging. The ship might zig to miss a Japanese destroyer salvo, and then zag right into a cruiser salvo. This was the period when the hits by the cruiser became most severe. According to the ship's action report, at about 9:30 a.m., a direct hit amidships was scored on one of the Japanese destroyers, and it was immediately enveloped in white smoke. The enemy destroyers made radical maneuvers and began to withdraw, but continued their fire on this vessel and other ships of the force. A friendly destroyer crossed our stern at about 500 yards, made smoke, and closed the Japanese destroyers. As she approached, firing of the 5-inch gun was ceased, and a TBM aircraft believed to be from the USS St. Lut had been circling the formation, made a steep glider stern of the ship, and strafed in the wake of the ship about 100 yards astern, exploding 2 torpedoes which had been fired from enemy destroyers. The explosion of the torpedoes was only a short while after the enemy had ceased surface shelling of the force. This was the first warning of a torpedo attack being launched against this ship. Immediately after these torpedoes exploded, another torpedo was sighted directly astern in the wake of the ship. It appeared to be broaching, breaking water, and the 5-inch gun on the fantail opened fire at a depressed elevation. A shell exploded approximately 10 feet ahead of the approaching torpedo. It was next observed veering to port. At least 12 other torpedo wakes were sighted on parallel courses on both sides of the ship. After the torpedo attack, the entire enemy surface force retired northward. Oddly enough, despite the Japanese force's efforts against the virtually undefended American force, they were not scoring very well at all. This was certainly not in line with the tradition of the South Pacific, where Japanese torpedoes, known as long lances, had earned a deadly reputation for being the best in the Pacific. The Kalinin Bay was far from destroyed, though it had taken some heavy punishment. The Fanshawe Bay took a hit from a 6-inch shell at 8:50 a.m., but it was the only shell of a salvo of 5 to hit. She was hit again 8 minutes later and jettisoned her firebombs just in case. Fires were set in the forecastle, and some damage was done to gas tanks, which began to leak and cause concern. By about 8:55 a.m., the ship was under fire from 2 cruisers and destroyers, and took another hit on the forward end of the flight deck. By 9:30 a.m., however, the torpedoes and Japanese forces had vanished, leaving the ship safe. The engine room reported that they needed to slow down due to overheating stacks caused by constant flank speed, which was a fire hazard. They had taken 6 shells, 4 direct hits and 2 near misses, resulting in 4 men killed and 5 seriously injured. The White Plains, in the centre of the forward line, was not hit at all, saw no torpedoes, and did not regard Japanese gunnery highly. The results suggest that the Japanese surface gunnery was not very effective, as all 13 of our ships involved should have been sunk given the number of projectiles fired at them. The ship was not hit, but received so many straddles that by chance it should have been hit several times. One salvo of 14-inch shells was particularly close, with 4 overs and 2 shorts. The percentage of hits was very low, despite the good shooting. The Kitkun Bay took 8 salvos from Japanese ships within 1,000 yards, but only 1 shot came close enough to cause any damage, landing 50 yards astern. The St. Lo took numerous straddles and near misses, mostly from destroyers on the starboard side of the formation. Although she was the starboard ship in the second line, no hits were observed, and only 3 men were injured from flying shrapnel. The more tragic story was that of the Gambier Bay. It seemed impossible that the Japanese, coming down like wolves on the fold, could avoid causing significant damage to their targets, yet they did sink the Gambier Bay. Here is the story of the sinking from the ship's action report and the captain's recollections. Captain WVRV ordered the launching of planes as soon as he learned of the Japanese arrival. The crew moved quickly, but there were problems due to changes in course to escape the Japanese. When planes were brought up on deck, there was very little relative wind, which made launching fully loaded torpedo planes difficult. The first torpedo plane was launched with only 35 gallons of gasoline, successfully launching a torpedo, but was subsequently lost. The second plane was launched with a full load of gasoline, but due to a change in course, there was only a 5-knot relative wind. The crew was pulled out of the plane, and the plane was catapulted without a crew. Gambier Bay's trouble was that she was on the windward side of the formation, which meant her smoke blew away quickly, leaving her exposed and visible. The captain manoeuvred the ship to avoid incoming salvos, but as the enemy closed in, the first hit came at 8:10 a.m., followed by continuous hits on the flight deck and spaces above the waterline. Shells caused fires and casualties, which were quickly addressed. At 8:20 a.m., a disastrous shell fell short and exploded near the forward engine room, flooding it and causing the speed to drop from 19 knots to 11 knots. Gambier Bay became a sitting duck. The Japanese poured on the fire, hitting the ship nearly every other minute. Shells that struck high did little damage, while those striking alongside or below the waterline caused severe damage. The second engine room went out, and the ship was dead in the water. Fires intensified, and with no water pressure, every hit caused more fires. By 8:50 a.m., with the ship helpless and surrounded by enemy fire, the captain ordered an abandonment. Captain V remained on the bridge until everyone had evacuated, then descended through the smoke-filled interior. He fell into the catwalk, but managed to escape into the water. Although his helmet and pistol provided little protection, the cold water revived him. As the ship rolled over and sank slowly, he swam away and observed a large Japanese ship dead in the water about 3 miles eastward. This ship eventually disappeared after sunset. Captain V and the survivors, who assembled on life rafts and flotsams, faced challenges as some died from wounds and others were eaten by sharks. The Japanese forces, after the battle, turned around and deserted the force they could have annihilated. Meanwhile, early in the morning, before the Japanese attack, the escort carriers had various tasks. Some pilots carried supplies to troops ashore, while others supported missions against Japanese ships and troops. The Kalinin Bay, not committed to morning tasks, was able to launch heavy airstrikes against the enemy. Lieutenant Commander W. H. Keeley led a group of planes that attacked Japanese cruisers and battleships, scoring hits and enduring heavy anti-aircraft fire. Ensign Altman and his team discovered 2 250-pound general-purpose bombs. They collaborated with 2 fighters from the Fanare Bay who had also landed at the location. They subsequently encountered a Nache cruiser. The fighters conducted strafing runs, while Ensign Altman carried out bombing runs, scoring 2 hits and disabling a forward turret. During the operation, one of the fighters shot down a Jake float plane belonging to the Japanese forces, which was evidently observing gunfire for the cruisers. A second group of dive bombers and torpedo bombers from the Keenan Bay was led by Lieutenant Walter D. Crockett. He was followed by Lieutenant Earl L. Archer, Jr., Ensign James B. Zitt Vogel, and Ensign G. Neen Smith. They ascended to 7,000 feet and entered the clouds. However, about a mile astern of the Japanese fleet, they descended through a gap in the cloud cover, only to find it covered by Japanese anti-aircraft fire. Lieutenant Crockett targeted what he believed to be a battleship. He attacked from the stern, bombed the target, and then climbed into the clouds. While diving, he observed one bomber hit by anti-aircraft fire and crash into the water, and his gunner saw another plane go down in flames. Crockett descended from the clouds for an attack, but his rockets fell short. His target was a destroyer. Lieutenant Archer joined Crockett, but focused on the last 2 destroyers in the column, strafing from 6,000 feet to 500 feet. He then searched for a target for his rockets and joined a flight of 7 torpedo planes and 10 fighters targeting the cruisers. Archer was the 3rd plane to attack, targeting the 2nd cruiser in the line, dropping bombs, and then engaging the lead cruiser with his 85 mm rockets. 2 rockets hit the bridge, damaging part of it. Ensign Smith, alongside Crockett, targeted a Tone-class cruiser closest to the carriers. He surprised the Japanese, who did not fire until he began attacking. Smith dropped 2 500-pound bombs and fired rockets, seeing the rockets hit the cruiser's superstructure, but the bombs missed. One landed 30 feet off the bow and the other near the stern. Ensign Zitt Vogel joined Crockett at 7,500 feet, but lost him during a steep climb to evade anti-aircraft fire. A fighter from the Fanare Bay joined Vogel, and they coordinated an attack on a cruiser. After Vogel lost the other plane, he climbed to 5,000 feet and then dove to attack a destroyer with rockets. He targeted the trailing destroyers coming in on the starboard side of the carriers, firing machine guns and rockets. 2 rockets hit amidships, while 2 others hit the water. Vogel then strafed other ships before running out of ammunition and joining 3 other bombers from the Gambia Bay to land at Taban. The field at Taban was in poor condition, causing several planes to crash due to soft spots on the runway. Loaded planes could not take off. Vogel did not get airborne again that day. Crockett landed aboard the White Plains, and Ensign Smith also landed there. Lieutenant Archer landed at Taycan, but had to stay overnight due to the field conditions. He volunteered as a landing officer, bringing in carrier planes as if landing on their own ship. Archer took 2 days to return to a ship, which was the Manila Bay, not his own. Manila Bay handled most of the pilots from the Kinin Bay's bombers, with fighters also contributing to the effort. Lieutenant John W. Murphy, along with Lieutenant Charles G. Simmons, Lieutenant Leonard H. Porterfield, Ensign Pete Goodman, and Ensign Charles T. Green, attacked the Japanese cruisers threatening Taffy 3. They approached at 10,000 feet, firing at 6,000 feet and diving at a 65 degrees angle. Murphy led the attack, followed by others. The initial impact was significant as the Japanese cruisers began zigzagging and anti-aircraft fire intensified. Murphy kept his planes out of formation to reduce risk. Following the third run, around 10 friendly fighters were observed attacking the cruisers. The planes made 3 more runs on the leading cruiser. After Lieutenant Murphy expended all his ammunition, he attempted to locate the rest of his division. However, the air was filled with FM-2S and TBF-1S, making runs on enemy fleet units, making it impossible to find them. Murphy and Ensign Goodman then went to Taycan and landed safely, but they were stuck, like so many others, by the bad condition of the field. They were out of it after the second run. Lieutenant Murphy's division and Lieutenant Simmons stayed up and were joined by an unidentified fighter. Together, they made a strafing attack on a Japanese cruiser that was shelling the escorts. Simmons made 3 strafing runs, and as he was on the last one, he noticed that the anti-aircraft fire was quieting down. He made 3 runs on the leading cruiser and then 4 more on 2 enemy cruisers, pulling out at 800 to 1,200 feet before 3 of his guns jammed. He climbed to 8,000 feet and tried to clear the guns, but could only get 1 to work. While up there, he saw 1 Japanese cruiser dead in the water. He circled and joined up with Lieutenant Samuel Frankovich and Ensign Jeffrey B. King for 1 more run on the cruiser. He looked around and saw that not only was Taffy 3 under attack, but Taffy 2 as well, so he went to Tacloban, long out of ammunition and with 20 gallons of gas, and landed at 9:45 a.m. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Kenneth G. Hipper took off at 7:50 a.m. and was joined by Ensign James. When Murphy and Ensign George A. Heinmiller's group climbed to 4,000 feet, Lieutenant Hipper led 3 effective strafing attacks on a Tone-class cruiser. The group rejoined and took on a Congo battleship. Then came word from fighter direction to concentrate on the closest cruisers to the escort carriers. Lieutenant Hipper made 4 runs on the closest cruiser and also looked for Japanese spotting planes but found none. His technique on attack was to climb to 7,000 feet, nose down, firing, and pull out at 500 feet or less. He liked that approach, feeling that the longer he waited to pull out, the less anti-aircraft fire he encountered. When he ran out of ammunition, he headed to Tacloban and landed with 7 gallons of gas. He refueled and rearmed there, but it was the same story. There had been too many accidents and the field was in rotten shape, so he was stuck until 11:45 a.m. when he took off and landed at 1:15 p.m. on the White Plains. Ensign Heinmiller had come in with Lieutenant Hipper, but lost him after the second run, so he joined up with anyone who came by to run in on the cruisers. Finally, he joined forces with Lieutenant Commander Keeley and made 3 runs on a cruiser. Then he lost Keeley and made 2 more runs alone. His plane began heating up and he climbed to 10,000 feet to cool it. He called fighter direction for instructions and was ordered to the beach. About 20 minutes later, he sighted a number of Japanese VALs and Zeeks, Zeros, heading toward the fleet. He saw 1 VAL that seemed to be struggling, and since he had about 150 rounds of ammunition, he made a pass at it, an overhead run, ending up on its tail. Coming out of cloud cover, when last seen, the VAL was smoking in a dive, out of control. The Zeeks were about 5 miles behind the VAL, so Ensign Heinmiller dived for the water and headed south. He was not pursued, and at 11:40 a.m. landed on Omini Bay. Lieutenant James "the Fan" Murphy was also with Hipper, but lost him after the third run on a cruiser. Murphy kept on making runs on that cruiser. After 4, he joined up with Lieutenant Leonard H. Porterfield. They made another run, and then Porterfield signaled that he was out of ammunition, so he headed for the beach while Murphy kept on fighting. He was then joined by Ensign Paul Hoppner, and they heard a request from Bendix's base fighter control to hit the Japanese destroyers attacking the escorts. He lost Ensign Hoppner, but made another run alone on the destroyer. He finally joined up with another fighter, and they started for Taban, but learned from operations there that the field was closed due to crashes and headed for the fleet. He landed finally on the St. Lo. Lieutenant William C. Coughlin joined up with the TBMs led by Patti Capano and with 4 other fighters from another carrier. After missing the fighter formation moving in on the cruisers, when the word came from control to attack the nearest cruisers, Lieutenant Capano sent Coughlin in on a strafing run. He made several runs ahead of the bombers to draw fire. He made 7 runs and saw planes getting hits with bombs and rockets on cruisers. At 9 a.m., he was out of ammunition and headed for Tacloban. He hit a soft spot on the runway and damaged the plane. Lieutenant Samuel Frankovich was launched at 7:10 a.m. in a rain squall and lost the planes that had preceded him. He joined up with 4 fighters from other carriers, and then Ensign King joined them, reporting he had just destroyed a Naval. They followed the other fighters, which circled the fleet but became impatient, broke off, and attacked a Congo-class battleship under heavy anti-aircraft fire. They were ordered to hit the advanced units, the cruisers and destroyers, that were damaging the escorts. They went in on cruisers and destroyers until they ran out of ammunition and landed at Tacloban at 9:30 a.m., rearmed and refueled, and took off again. King damaged his port wing on takeoff on the bad field and headed back. Frankovich accompanied him part way and then headed off. One tragedy was that of Lieutenant Patti Capano, who had led the bombers in the beginning. He had landed at Tacloban, but his plane was so badly shot up that it was unusable. Eager to get back to his ship, he borrowed a TBM from a wounded pilot from the St. Lowe. He boarded with his crew, aviation radio man First Class Malcolm J. Gordon and torpedo man's mate First Class Gordon E. Galloway, and they also took along Ensign Paul Hopner, whose plane had been damaged and who also wanted to get back to Kinnin Bay. But Capano came in when the escort carriers were under heavy attack, and they sent him back to Tacloban. He never arrived, and thus Capano and his crew were missing in action. Ironically, Ensign Hopner, who had survived his mission, was also missing in action. Lieutenant Robert T. Sell made a forced landing off Samar, but was picked up later. Lieutenant Porterfield crashed trying to take off from Tacloban and was injured. The plane was wrecked. Ensign Jeffrey King crashed on landing at Darg and wrecked his plane, but was safe, though injured. Lieutenant Coughlin nosed over on landing at Tacloban, but was not hurt. That was the story of one squadron. There were many such stories, and the Japanese commented on the fierceness with which the Americans fought in the sky and on the sea that day. Admiral Kurita's operations officer had this to say: "The attack was almost incessant, but the number of planes at any one instant was few. The bombers and torpedo planes were very aggressive and skillful, and the coordination was impressive. Even in comparison with the great experience of American attacks that we had already had, this was the most skillful work of your planes." Here is what the squadron had to say about itself in the action report prepared after the battle. It is impossible to single out a group of individuals whose exploits stand out as being particularly noteworthy. The entire action was remarkable, conducted by our airmen without the slightest regard for personal safety. They pressed home their attacks determinedly, unremittingly, and their conduct was exemplary. It writes another chapter in the glorious history of naval aviation, devotion to duty in the highest traditions of the naval service. That day was commonplace if those words had been used often before in the history of naval operations. They were still certainly true of the naval aviators and destroyer and escort men that day. When their carriers were threatened, they swarmed like angry bees, and it would seem that they drove off the Japanese because suddenly, before noon, the Japanese broke the action and moved north. That, however, is another story. The sighting of the American force, and particularly an American force that fled from the Japanese fleet, very nearly unnerved Admiral Kurita. No question about it, and it even shows in the action report of his force. A lookout saw masts. It was subsequently definitely established that the masts belonged to ships of a gigantic enemy task force, including 6 or 7 carriers accompanied by many cruisers and destroyers. With the almost complete lack of intelligence that Admiral Kurita had received in the last week, and his gradual and growing knowledge over the period that Radio Tokyo and Imperial Navy headquarters had been vastly overestimating the amount of damage done to the Americans off Fossa, It is small wonder that he was confused. Perhaps a Togo could have overcome all these factors and figured out immediately what to do. Not knowing what lay ahead, behind, or on his outside flank, it suffices to say that Admiral Kurita was not a Togo. He was a brave, loyal, and trusted officer of His Imperial Majesty, but he was not a master strategist. Furthermore, the Japanese were definitely on edge. Scarcely an officer in the fleet did not know or suspect that theirs was likely to be a suicide mission. They were determined to take as many of the enemy with them as they could, and they wanted to make every action count. It was no good going on a suicide mission to end up on a reef or in a prisoner of war camp. Besides, the sighting came at the most inopportune time when the fleet was changing from night disposition to morning anti-aircraft formation. Immediately, Admiral Kurita ordered an attack formation, but the result was that it was some time before matters were straightened out. In the meantime, the world of fishes and the enemy was treated to the sight of battleships very nearly crossing one another's bows, and destroyers and cruisers, exhibiting thorough signs of confusion as the action began. Admiral Kurita was turning over in his mind all he had learned. What was this force? He knew that Admiral Nishimura had been hard hit the night before by some force. Were the Americans ubiquitous? It was enough to challenge any man's imagination. At the moment of sighting the Americans, Kurita and his staff noted down their estimate of the situation. They assessed that the enemy was encountered at a time when neither he nor we expected it. Employing every trick known to him, the enemy would try to put distance between himself and us, if possible, maneuver himself to the windward of us, so that he could carry out a one-sided air action against us. So, to take advantage of this heaven-sent opportunity, we should take after the enemy in present formation and at top speed. We planned first to assess the carrier's ability to have planes take off and land on them, and then to mow down the entire task force. Thus, the battle plan was made based on the assumption that these were fleet carriers and light carriers of the type the Japanese had encountered at Coral Sea, Midway, and the first battle of the Philippine Sea off the Marianas. That was a basic mistake, and it coloured Admiral Kurita's philosophy completely. He simply did not understand that what he had before him were slow-moving auxiliary ships built for the purpose of anti-submarine patrol and landing support. Here is the engagement from the Japanese point of view. As befitted the flagship, the Yamato opened fire. She fired at 6:58 a.m. that morning. 2 minutes later, she announced to the fleet that there were 3 enemy carriers. 2 minutes after that, Admiral Kurita ordered the third section, Admiral Nishimura and Admiral Shima, to join, and reported that he was engaging the enemy. What that order meant is confusing, because Kurita knew that Nishimura had been hard hit. Perhaps he hoped that Nishimura could still make at least a diversion to the south, or perhaps the order to Nishimura was simply performed for the benefit of Imperial headquarters. Admiral Kurita ordered the cruisers to move in on the carriers and take them, and the destroyers to move in so they could conduct a torpedo attack. Squalls and bad weather upset the visibility, and the Japanese radar was not equal to the task of blind fighting. Radar or not, the Japanese depended far more than the Americans on visual aids in fighting a naval battle. Radar was too new to them and not as well developed. They simply did not have the equipment or experience to compete in this field. For some reason, in this battle, the Japanese went far beyond the usual number of errors in over-exaggerating the effects of their weapons on the enemy. The Americans did it in the heat of battle. Mistakes in identification and hopeful errors in damage assessment were routine. However, intelligence officers had been taught caution, while Japanese intelligence officers seemed more eager to tell their superiors what they wanted to hear. A good summary of the Japanese view of the battle can be found in the report of the 7th Cruiser Division, which carried much of the action for the Japanese fighting force that day and lost 2 cruisers in the fight. At sunrise, the cruisers were standing by at 28 knots, with engines ready for maximum battle speed in 20 minutes. The Japanese sighted the Americans. The cruiser saw them first, and the Suzuya and the Kumo were not far behind. At 7:03 a.m., Admiral Kurita ordered the cruisers to attack, and cruiser flagship Kumano relayed the order to the others. By 7:10 a.m., Admiral Kurita had discovered there were 6 carriers, which were to be the primary targets. The cruisers attacked, and at 7:15 a.m., the Japanese reported they had set fire to 1 American carrier. The cruisers, carriers, and destroyers of both sides were in action now, with the Americans making smoke and the Japanese firing through it. At 7:24 a.m., 3 torpedo tracks were sighted off the starboard bow of the Kumo, torpedoes fired by the American destroyers. One hit the Japanese cruiser's bow, severing a section and reducing the cruiser's speed to 14 knots. At the same moment, one of the carrier planes struck home, causing a near miss on the Suzuya that made her port inboard shaft unusable and caused leakage of seawater into the after fuel tanks. This reduced her usable fuel supply to 800 tons and her maximum speed to 23 knots. As the flagship Kumano lost speed, the Suzuya took command, though she was hurt. The attacks never ceased. At 7:44 a.m., 3 torpedo planes, followed by 5 bombers, attacked Chikuma and Tone. Anti-aircraft action was intense. Chikuma evaded by a wide turn to starboard, while Tone evaded by a wide turn to port. Both ships returned to their former courses and continued advancing eastward, separated by a gap of 6 kilometers. 10 minutes later, Tone was under attack again. At about 8 a.m., the flag and staff of the division moved over to Kumano. The admiral, 4 staff officers, 2 attached officers, and 2 petty officers were all involved. The Japanese were talking excitedly about Independence-class carriers, fleet carriers, and Baltimore cruisers, but they were facing nothing so serious. The fight was serious, no doubt about it. At 8:28 a.m., the captain of the Tone was wounded in one of those strafing attacks by the planes above, and the Suzuya was having her troubles. Her captain tried to raise the speed to 24 knots, but she vibrated so badly she had to drop back. At 8:38 a.m., Tone claimed to have sunk a Ranger-type carrier. This was the Gambia Bay. At 8:45 a.m., Tone fired torpedoes at an American destroyer she thought was a cruiser. She was taking serious damage from shell fire from the destroyers, too. Tone also claimed to have sunk an enemy light cruiser, which took a heavy list and then blew up and sank. At about 8:53 a.m., the Chikuma moved up just as 30 American carrier planes attacked Chikuma, Tone, Haguro, and Chokai. According to the Japanese report, 4 torpedo planes executed an extremely low-level attack on Chikuma, 2 from each side. Several enemy fighters were simultaneously over the ship. Chikuma observed firing at enemy planes with all her guns. Seen from Tone at a distance of about 5 kilometers, 1 torpedo plane and 1 fighter were shot down off Chikuma's starboard side. A torpedo hit on Chikuma was observed from Tone as follows. While Chikuma was maneuvering to evade 2 torpedo planes which attacked first from the starboard side, she evaded by turning toward the planes. 2 other torpedo planes made an extremely low-level attack from the port side. Shortly thereafter, a torpedo apparently hit the stern, causing a burst of flame and a column of water almost as high as the length of the ship. The afterdeck's single-mount machine gun and other gear were seen blown into the air. The after half of the afterdeck was heavily damaged and settled in the water, but the ship continued to move at slow speed and her guns kept on firing. She circled around, flying a signal indicating that her rudder was knocked out. No marked external damage other than the stern was observed. At 8:54 a.m., the cruisers were talking about a strong enemy force located off the starboard bow within 10 kilometers but hidden by a squall. It seemed inconceivable to the Japanese that the Americans had not yet produced any battleships. Observers could see some results of their shooting, straddles and hits on the carriers, but American smoke-making was very effective, and most of those carriers succeeded in spending a good deal of time hiding. Each time the cruisers would move around to get a view, the carriers would duck into smoke or squall, and the destroyers and escorts would make more smoke. Meanwhile, the Chokai, another cruiser, had been smashed by bombs or torpedoes, and was in worse shape than the Chikuma. At 8:10 a.m., when everything seemed to be going well for the Japanese, the Haruna sighted a second group of carriers to the southeast. This naturally got the Japanese considering what they might face ahead. 6 fleet carriers and more carriers below. How many carriers did the Americans have, and where were the destroyers and battleships? Admiral Kurita put up 2 of his fleet's slender supply of float planes for observation. The fate of one was described by the aviators of the Kinnin Bay. The fate of the other was the same. The Japanese got no comfort from their float planes and precious little information before they disappeared from the scene. The Tone and the Haguro of the Japanese 7th Cruiser Division were closing in on the Americans, but they were the only ships in the division actively engaged. The others seemed more half-hearted, and the battleships were virtually out of it. One reason was that one of the American destroyers fired a spread of torpedoes at the Yamato. To evade them, she turned and ran 7 miles from the battle before she could lose them, putting Admiral Kurita out of it too. With bad radio communication, bad visual communication, bad radar, and no spotter planes, the Japanese destroyers launched their torpedo attack at about 9:05 a.m., but from almost 15,000 yards, which was hardly very daring, and no hits were made. As for the Japanese, the Tone was hit, the battleship Kongo was harried, the Chikuma and the Chokai were out of it, and the Kumo was badly damaged. But the Japanese were still as strong as a gang of foxes in a henhouse. Thus it came as a surprise to the commander of the Tone and to others when at 9:14 a.m. Admiral Kurita ordered all ships to reassemble and head north. The Tone was then talking about a torpedo attack to the Haguro and Tone, estimated that continuing the pursuit attack on the enemy carrier group would be extremely effective, and that this favourable tactical opportunity should not be lost. However, in view of the 9:14 a.m. reassembly order from the flag, and the necessity of regrouping the force for the penetration into Leyte Gulf, she broke off the pursuit and followed Admiral Kurita's order. Kurita's second float plane had gone out of contact at 9:04 a.m., and it took him only 10 minutes more to order the regrouping and retirement. Whatever was ordered, the Yamato swung around to the left, and Kurita headed north reluctantly. Other units did the same. The foxes were leaving the henhouse, and much as they could not believe it, the Americans were saved. Perhaps better than any other source, the diary of Japanese Admiral Ugaki gives a sense of what happened in Admiral Kurita's fleet during that fateful morning of October 25th. Coupled with the story of certain events occurring outside the fleet itself, it shows the extent of the lost opportunity. Although the Japanese would not know it for some time, they had come within an ace of doing precisely what they set out to do in the show plan: disrupt the American invasion of the Philippines. As they chased the Americans south toward Leyte Gulf, the Japanese intercepted many American transmissions. They were told that the enemy had requested aid from friendly forces by plain language telephone, and that the reply was it would require 2 hours. This was Oldendorf's force to the south, which was 65 miles away. From this, it was concluded that there was an enemy force nearby. The question now was, which force should they head for? Meanwhile, Admiral Kincaid was as worried and upset as a commander whose whole force is endangered could be, and his state of mind was certainly not helped by the fact that there was literally nothing more he could do from his flag plot on the Wasatch. Admiral Wilkinson described the situation aptly later in a letter when he said he felt like the girl whose fair white body was being fought over by the good guy and the bad guy. Here is Admiral Kincaid's recollection of the events. The escort carriers were being driven south by the Japanese cruisers. I had a dispatch from Sprague asking for permission to enter Leyte Gulf, and I sent back a negative reply. To enter Leyte Gulf meant that they would be in confined waters. They'd be easy marks for air. If they got as far as the entrance of Leyte Gulf, he would be joined by my surface ships for cover. The message I sent to Oldendorf, as soon as I had the report of our escort carriers under fire, was to assemble all of his ships at the northern part of the entrance to Leyte Gulf and get them all there as quickly as possible. That was followed a little bit later by an order to divide his ships into 2 groups and send one group outside to block a Marabay to our entrance to Leyte Gulf. I didn't want to send those ships outside of Leyte Gulf, although at that time the escort carriers were in dire need, but I couldn't let them be hammered to pieces without doing anything, so I gave these preliminary orders. Meanwhile, Admiral Kinkaid was trying very hard to find out what help he could get from Holly. He did not know precisely where Holly was and sent a string of messages, some of them in the clear. What he wanted was Task Force 34, those fast battleships which could clear Japanese waters very quickly if they could be brought into position. But he did not get them until after the great battle was over. In fact, he did not get anything from Holly because that admiral was too far north and east, engaging the Ozawa force. Just at about the time Holly discovered that Kinkaid was under attack by a force that had, after all, turned back and steamed through San Bernardino Strait, his planes found Ozawa and the action began up north. Kinkaid was insistent and called for aid from the fast battleships again. He called for a strike from Task Force 38, the carrier force. Unfortunately, there was not a carrier unit within range of the problem. Admiral McCain was close and was dispatched to help Kinkaid, but he did not arrive until the afternoon, when the matter of the battle between Kurita and the escort carriers was long resolved. What did happen with Kinkaid's insistent calls was that Washington and Pearl Harbor, where they were listening in to the messages, became alert and outraged that Holly would desert San Bernardino Strait. Admiral Nimitz interfered by sending a message to Holly asking what had happened to the fast battleships, which changed the course of the battle. However, as for help for Kinkaid, it did not come. Forever after, Holly maintained that he had no responsibility to defend the Seventh Fleet tactically. His was a strategic defense. And he had headed for the carriers, taking the calculated risk that Kurita might come through. Yet all this interchange of messages, some of them in plain English, had a sort of reverse English effect on the Japanese admiral. Kurita was not sure what the real purpose of these messages was, but he gathered that there were strong forces afloat elsewhere than in the later Gulf area, and he began to have second thoughts about his own mission. He also thought Admiral Kinkaid might be trying somehow to trick him. What happened to Kurita in the beginning was that he lost tactical control of his fleet when the surprise came of seeing the Americans, and he never did regain it fully. The attack of the destroyers was sloppy, and the cruisers, particularly after 3 of them were put into a sinking or badly damaged condition, were not working together well, according to Admiral Ugaki. It was decided first of all to go down the centre and destroy the group of carriers, and then it was decided that the fleet should head for the enemy off to the east, which meant the Holly force if they could find it. We accordingly changed course to south-southeast and headed in that direction, but it was already too late, and we were unable to locate the aforementioned carrier group headquarters. Kurita heard Destroyer Squadron 10 ordering an abortive torpedo attack and directed all ships to gradually assemble to the north. We changed course to north. The time was 9:24 a.m. As they moved, the cruiser Chokai transferred her crew to a destroyer and was abandoned. Then she was sunk. The Haguro moved north and tried to repair the bomb damage to her No. 2 turret. The Suzuya was lagging. The Chikuma got out of line, and she and her destroyer escort, the Noaki, lost the formation forever while heading north. Flashes were sighted in direction 280, and the fleet headed in that direction while continuing to assemble. Scattered patches of water, coloured by dye-loaded shells, and a considerably large area of darkish red water were immediately beyond the latter, with enemy survivors some clinging to damaged cutters and some just drifting. I wonder what these survivors thought on seeing our fleet sweep boldly by in pursuit, even though they were in need of help. They gave no indication of it when they saw who we were. While the Japanese moved about indecisively, American planes continued to bomb. At 10:14 a.m., the Suzuya was smashed again and began to waver, becoming unnavigable. The fire reached her torpedoes. Cruiser Division 7's flag was transferred to the Tone. The Suzuya was abandoned and sank. For the remainder of that day, a destroyer was damaged in that air attack. At 10:14 a.m., the enemy survivors who witnessed this spectacle from afar must have given 3 cheers. Then, at 11:20 a.m., Admiral Kurita decided to go back into later Gulf again and gave orders. But at 12:15 p.m., while steaming south, the force was hit again by 30 planes. This time they moved into their circular anti-aircraft formation and drove off the Americans without substantial damage. At this time, too, Admiral Kurita apparently saw something else that unnerved him, a Pennsylvania-class battleship mast. Now there was no Pennsylvania-class nor any other battleship in the area, but there had been talk about it taking 2 hours to bring help, and this was more than 2 hours later. So Admiral Kurita, without aerial eyes or any useful vertical bar intelligence, had to rely on imagination. The battleship Pennsylvania was the result of good imagination. The fleet launched another float plane, but apparently it was shot down, or at least gave no sufficient information for action. Kurita wavered. At 1:13 p.m. he decided that he would not go into Leyte Gulf and changed course to due north. They were attacked again by American planes at 1:16 p.m.,